So we've heard a lot about academic freedom over the past few months. We know that that for most of early American history, educators could be fired for espousing dangerous ideas, real or perceived, without much uproar. And it was only around the turn of the century that anyone began to talk about academic freedom, although there remained disagreements then as now about exactly what that entails. And so the AAUP in 1915 declared a set of principles as a three-pronged approach to the freedom to teach, the freedom to research within a professor's discipline, and the most contentious among them, the freedom as a citizen to the same speech rights that everyone else in this country has. Yet in 2024, we see that campuses have witnessed a flood of pro-Palestinian protests in response to Israel's military actions in Gaza. So Harvard University's policies have prohibited chalking and unapproved signage. Indiana University has restricted quote-unquote expressive activity between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. And we even saw here in New York, Columbia University, a physical dismantling of a protest encampment, fancy way of getting at these students who were occupying a building. And we know that President Trump has continued this line of attack on universities, singling out some of the world's wealthiest schools, what critics say is an attack on academic freedom. So where does that leave us as academics, other than a little bit frightened? I think we have to understand that more than 79% of American students report being at least somewhat reluctant to talk about controversial issues. 1 in 3 faculty have recently toned down their writing for fear of causing controversy. Even though only about 13% of students report actually being sanctioned for discussing a controversial topic, the perception is there. And then, of course, the confidence of the general public in higher ed has decreased dramatically. And Republicans, in particular, have decreased the most. In fact, in 2015, 56% of Republicans had a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in higher ed. Now it's about 20%. So it's dropped dramatically. So this is particularly a problem, as we've heard, for a number of years now among conservative students. So what I propose is thinking about a public opinion course, or as a course in political communication, political science, American government. Any of these courses would be a good avenue to teach public opinion as a tool for civic efficacy, as a tool for helping students learn what public opinion is and how to use it and harness it to understand the community better. So I've been doing this for a number of years now at the University of Delaware, and we do what's called the annual Blue Hen Poll. If you're not familiar, University of Delaware's mascot is a blue hen, specifically a fightin' blue hen. And so we do this annual poll every fall, and we call it a poll for students by students. So it's a way for students to actually have some efficacy, have some input into what's actually being measured. So I like talking about public opinion as a very abstract concept, because I think when we live in a place where we are bombarded by polls left and right all the time, it's important for students to understand, like, well, what exactly is public opinion? Is it just an aggregation of just adding up people's opinions, which is how the media often interpret it? And these categories of public opinion come from Carol Glynn's book, et al., of 2018. Or is it a majoritarian way, that basically the public opinion reflects the majority's beliefs? Or is it simply a clash of groups, where traditional opinion polls treat all respondents equally, but in the real world, certain interest groups maintain higher power than others? Then there's the idea that public opinion is media and elite opinion. And then finally, that public opinion is a fiction, that there is no real way of actually measuring true public opinion. This is evidenced through lots of research on non-attitudes, like Bishop et al. In the 70s and 80s would measure people's opinion on fictional issues, and 30 to 40% of people students to be agile in their thinking as well as critical consumers of these public opinion polls. So I like to incorporate discovery learning here, which is basically this approach advocates a sort of a problem-based learning is another way of putting this. That basically, because we know that students have limited working memory and that this kind of course requires an increased cognitive load, they're having to create things, not just regurgitate back information on an exam, for example. So I suggest that we use this. Oh, I forgot to mention that this comes from a book chapter that's coming out later this year or early 2026 called Teaching Political Communication. So it's an edited volume of lots of different ways to teach things like this. So scaffolding in this sense is there's structured support that aids students in navigating difficult tasks. Most of your students have never created a public opinion poll before. They might have received a poll through an email from the college. They probably deleted it right away, didn't even take the poll. My ulterior motive in this is to encourage survey karma, like take their survey and maybe they'll take your survey. So, but scaffolding, if you're not aware, there's 3 types of scaffolding. Cognitive scaffolding structures the learning process and helps students manage complex tasks by breaking them into smaller parts. Metacognitive scaffolding, this is a really important part of my class, is having them think about what they're doing, evaluating what they're doing, evaluating each other's work, and interacting with the professor as well to reflect upon the questions that they've created, how people might interpret that question differently, allow peer review, peer feedback. And then social scaffolding is supporting through collaboration, discussion, and feedback. So there's a lot of team meetings. So I break, the class typically is about 25 students. I break it into 5 teams, and so each team will come up with their own topic. They will decide what do they want to know about what their fellow students think, and so there's a lot of team meetings and peer feedback. And I'll show you a quote from one of the students later on. It feels kind of like almost like an apprenticeship or an internship rather than a course. So there are some challenges associated with this type of course. If you do want to publish any of your work from these surveys, you need to get approval from your IRB. Of course, that can vary depending on what your institution is. It's also sometimes difficult to recruit respondents. We have an institutional research office that has data on all of our students, but understandably, our IR office does not want to give every professor access to all of their students to send out surveys, right? So I have to demonstrate to that office that there's a campus need for this type of survey and that we only do it once a year, typically with incentives, with a gift card raffle, for example. We get about a 20% response rate. Doesn't sound great, but it's amazing. Then you have to navigate your universities. Do they have Qualtrics? Do they have SurveyMonkey? There are other free options you can use. A random sample is obviously best, but it may not be possible. You may have to do a snowball sample or something else. Again, these are all things that you can discuss with your students about best methods. Hopefully you have the SAGE Research Methods database. This has a lot of great information about how to ask good polling questions. So then a lot of the course is devoted to designing the survey instrument. So I do a longitudinal research design, at least for some items, basically asking the same questions. And actually they come from the HXA Campus Climate Survey, asking about students' willingness to speak up in the classroom, et cetera. But then the rest of the survey differs by year based on the students in the class. They decide what they do. Quickly, I'll just say that you want to help students understand that there are ways to create branching and skipping options so that students, if you answered yes to this question, you will go to this question, et cetera. So they learn like the real ins and outs of what public opinion polling is. And I have had several students come to me and say, I got my internship because I took this class and told them I knew how to create a survey. Or I took this to my boss because they were asking survey questions that were all open-ended. And they were like, how do we interpret this? How do we make sense of this? And I suggested we do this, that, and the other. And so this has happened over and over again. I mean, every man, woman, brother, sister is taking a survey of everyone all the time, right? No matter what industry you're in, you're taking surveys. Think about good question wording, and then providing incentives is always a help. After we've submitted our we've created our survey, we've submitted it to IRB for approval. Then it's just a waiting period, right, for IRB to approve. So then we can flesh out more abstract concepts around public opinion, and then also work within Qualtrics is what we have, using the reports function to create crosstabs, create data visualizations across demographic groups. So this question is just an example from last fall's poll. How much do you approve or disapprove of the military action Israel has taken in Gaza? So Kamala Harris voters strongly disagree. Donald Trump voters, most of them are in the middle, neither agree nor disagree. So, and then I think what the most exciting part of this is, and this is a picture from last fall, is the students have to do a press conference. And so I work with local media, student media, to put out a press release for the press conference. The students have to prepare their slides. They have to, again, create their data visualization. It's a little nerve-wracking for them, even though these are communication students. They've taken public speaking. I make sure that they do a run-through. We do several run-throughs of the press conference before they actually do it. And then I work with journalism and writing professors to also make this maybe a course requirement or extra credit, just to see that we get a lot of attendance there and the students have a real-world experience. So this is just some examples of, we did ask an open-ended question about what one word represents how you feel about the 2024 election. This went out the day after the election, so disappointing, stressful, scary, messy, crazy. So not surprising. But then we also ask students to run other data visualizations and interpret what that might mean. And I was really impressed with my students who were interested in specifically the conflict in Gaza. And they asked questions about what people knew about this conflict. And if you just look at that first bar chart, this tells you which statements are true and false. This first one is false, that Palestine and Israel have been in conflict for centuries. A huge majority of students thought that that was true. So they have a misunderstanding. And what my students interpreted this as, because they also measured things like how much they're following the news about the conflict, what their background knowledge is, what their opinions are. My students coined this. I'm so proud of them. They said this is an engagement paradox, that basically this suggests the student body is informed but hesitant to engage publicly with the issue, creating a campus environment where knowledge and opinions exist but rarely translate into visible action or discourse. So in other words, they also found that this conflict was not impacting who they voted for or how they voted. So students can come up with really unique, interesting ways to interpret these ideas. So I'll wrap up here because it's my time. So this course, I don't know if your university has this, but we have a requirement that one course in your college curriculum should be at DLE, or Discovery Learning Experience. So this counts as one of those, and that makes it attractive to students to want to take the class, because let's face it, students aren't looking for extra work, and this requires a little extra work. And this has a broader impact on the students beyond just providing a community resource. Because at the end of the day, this provides an annual community resource to understand what our students are thinking. And they also get nuanced understanding of our hypermediated world, plus these real world skills about how to ask good questions and how to interpret data. We live in a data-driven world, and this is a great way for students to learn how to interpret that. So one student in a course evaluation said, "I like that the class worked together. We had real conversations about the world. The professor talked to us like people rather than just students." And I think that that's a really cool thing for a student to say, and I'm happy to answer any questions. We are going to take about 3 to 5 minutes for questions after each presentation, and I will introduce the next speaker, but I'll take questions after applause, of course. Thank you. Yes?
Yeah, I've been recommending something like this in one of my classes for a first-year composition course, and I don't do a lot of research on my own, so I don't have a ton of experience with IRB, but if you're having a whole class of students getting that approval, do you approach it differently when submitting your applications versus when you do it yourself to IRB?
Yeah, so they have to take training. So it's usually through CITI training, is CITI training, which is just like an online module that they all hate. But my department is incorporating it into our research methods class, so that's a required class for all students to take. So eventually, by the time they get to this class, which is a 400 level class, they all would have been required to take that training. But it's several hours of just online training. So they all get a certificate. They have to take that before, if they're listed as researchers on the IRB protocol, they need to have that training completed. And it's actually great because it's all about the ethics of surveying human subjects and researching human beings. So it talks about the Stanford prison experiment and Milgram studies, like all that stuff. It's actually a really nice supplement to just understanding research on human beings in general. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This is great. I was especially intrigued by these moments when surveys reveal what might be a lack of understanding or lack of knowledge. So the question about centuries.
Right.
I would argue that doesn't reveal misunderstanding. It reveals, like I said, lack of understanding, lack of historical knowledge. So it's very interesting when engagements with conflicts are kind of become ahistorical, become something else. And I wonder if these surveys, when they reveal, do they reveal curricular interventions that need to take place? And so are there places in which students can find, wow, this is an area in which maybe a course in history of a conflict, for example,
Sure.
might be useful?
Absolutely. I haven't necessarily used the results of these surveys for that, but I mean, I'm hoping each year I try to get more and more people to attend the press conference and to be more engaged. I've introduced this to several other committees that I'm on. Universities are these multiple silos. It's hard to broadcast these kinds of things, but I think there's certainly some curricular implications there. And what I've discovered is that students, and I think we all know this, college students are not all that well informed on particularly a lot of international conflicts and international goings on. So I think what it helped reveal to them was like, oh, I'm not the only one who doesn't really understand this. My fellow students also kind of don't get this, but then they're kind of making they can make conclusions like, but we're all still talking about it like we know about it, and we're voting for people because we think, well, that's what everybody else thinks, right? So it reveals to them a lot of these more abstract concepts around public opinion, which is perceptions of others' views of public opinion, how that impacts our own views. Like I said, there's non-attitudes, expressing attitudes when you really don't know what you think about it. So it offers the students, I think, like I come back to that idea of efficacy. It sort of gives them like, oh, it's okay maybe that I don't, and intellectual humility, like it's okay that I don't know what I don't know. So it's a great exercise in that sense. But I think certainly has curricular opportunities. Yes?
Thanks for the talk. I really appreciate that you went with the press conference and then kind of sharing this information on the student body with others. I'm curious about, do you have a sense of whether students on campus getting to really see diversity of opinion on different topics has changed anything about their ability to have discourse with each other? I mean, I know it's hard to know what all the students are talking about, but just like, what have you maybe seen outside of your classroom?
So, as I said, this is part of the reason I created this chapter for this book. I just pulled it up. It's called Teaching Political Communication. It's published by the Elgar Publishing as part of their Elgar Guides to Teaching series. And I'm trying to scale this up so that more campuses do these kinds of things so that they can get a better understanding. At this point, it's a relatively small impact, so I can't say I see much beyond the students in my class. But it does usually get picked up in like the local NPR affiliate, and they'll, but that's the other thing too, is I talk a lot about public opinion as a newsworthy thing that, if you look at the news on any given day, if there's a poll, they're going to report about it. Do they report the margin of error? No, not necessarily. So it's a lot of like nuts and bolts around the polling, but also helping them understand what was newsworthy about our press conference? Like what did the news media take away from it? So hoping to scale that up, hoping to get more visibility so we can see a broader impact. But at this point, it's still in its infancy. I think, yeah, one more question. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of how to, we talk a lot about leading and loaded questions. We talk about our own cognitive biases and how the way we frame a question might trigger somebody to answer in a certain way. So that's a huge part of that first part of the course, is just really like digging into, and they'll say, well, what if we just ask about blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, I'm trying to think of a good example. I'm just going to use something stupid, but like, why do Republicans suck? Or like something like that. Like, what do you think people are going to think about when they answer that question? So it's like, okay, what is your feeling? What on a feeling thermometer from 0 to 100? What is your feeling about Republicans? What is your feeling about Democrats? And so it's interesting to them ways of not purposefully introducing bias into the way people respond to surveys. We know that they're still going to interpret things differently, but and again through those ideas of like branching and skipping questions, so that if you don't do a certain behavior, we're not asking you a bunch of questions about it. I'm always telling them, like, you don't want to piss people off. They're already like, oh, take a survey, fine, I'll take a survey. 4 students by students, okay, blue hen poll, I'll do it because my friend's in the class, whatever. But you get to a point where you're asking them questions where they've already said, I don't do this, and you're like, how often do you do this? And when was the last time you did this? Now you're just pissing people off and they're going to just leave the survey. And so you have a lot of incomplete surveys. So, they learn a lot about the mechanics behind good survey questions. So it's honestly, it's very close to a methods class, like a research methods class. But I don't want to take any more time because I have colleagues who have many more important things to present. So I will introduce our next paper. This is Whitney Graf at the University of Chicago. The paper is Using Behavior Analysis to Increase Student Engagement in the Classroom.
Okay. Thank you for having me. I'm Whitney Graf, and I feel like it's sort of like, and now for something completely different. So I'm a practicing clinical psychologist, and I also teach social work students at the University of Chicago Crown Family School of Social Work Policy and Practice. I've been teaching this class the last 6 years or so, and so I thought I would put something together on what I've kind of developed teaching this specific class, and I hope that I can offer you sort of a nugget to take with you, sort of a framework or a lens to use. Maybe it's useful in your classrooms. I understand what I teach is very, very specific, but maybe there's something in this where using the kind of framework that I use, it's just sort of a new way of thinking about student engagement and managing the classroom. So the class that I teach is on a method called Functional Analytic Psychotherapy, or we call it FAP for short, which is a sort of unfortunate name, but that's what it's called, and that's what we're sticking with. And in this method, essentially we're using radical behaviorism, and we're using that to influence therapeutic relationships. So when I started teaching this, I thought, you can't teach this without also doing it. And so integrating the content of it, but also doing it kind of live with my students, even in a sort of boundaried way. They're not my therapy clients, but I am in relationship with them. So let me show you a little bit about what I mean there. Here's our basic behaviorism. I don't know if you care or know any about this, but this is sort of where I geek out a little bit. I asked actually ChatGPT to write me a poem giving me the history of behaviorism. We're really focusing on B.F. Skinner, who developed radical behaviorism and started talking about how rewards and punishments influence behavior, and including internal behavior like thoughts and feelings. So just to define our terms, when I talk about rewards, I actually use the term reinforcements. So something is reinforcing if it makes a behavior more likely to occur. So that can kind of be anything, but however we respond that makes what happened immediately before more likely to happen, we've reinforced it. Punishment, it's just the opposite. It's got kind of a bad connotation, but we've punished a behavior just if we've made it less likely to occur again. So just to visualize that, we all can think about like how we've trained our dogs or whatever. I want to actually expand this a little bit, because when I use this in my classroom, I'm not giving giving a treat. We're not rewarding in this way. I actually want you to think about it almost completely differently. So within the tradition that this treatment sits, we have some assumptions about human behavior. So we assume that the behaviors are learned through reinforcement. So if you know how to do it, it's because sometime in the past you've been reinforced for it. And if you continue doing it, there's some kind of a system that's keeping it going. So whatever the behavior that you're curious about, if it's happening, something is keeping it going. And I think that there's implications for this in our classroom environment where if we're thinking, I'm going to get into this in a minute, but if we're thinking about the ways that students engage in discussion, they have histories of reinforcement that they are bringing to those discussions. And that environment itself is reinforcing and punishing live as it's happening. We also assume that the behavior has that function. So I sometimes think that reframing behavior as functional, it does something for us, can take us out of a judgmental space. So here's where I think we have this giant caveat that takes this in a new direction. When you think about the idea of a reward, like I showed you those pictures before, generally you're going to think about what is called a contrived reinforcement. And this is where we kind of assign value, or we use something like a token economy, or there's a lot of research into this, the good behavior game, something called interdependent group contingency, where we actually set up a system where we say, these are the things that are going to be reinforced. These are the things we're going to reward. And these do work. So there's a good amount of research into how we can create systems of reinforcement to get students to maybe work together in teams or to change their study habits and things like this. And a lot of what I looked at, the outcome assessments were things like test scores. So did this translate to perhaps more learning? So if we set up a classroom contingency plan, we can increase learning, or at least we can increase test scores, whether or not that measures learning. But there are some downsides to this sort of contrived reinforcement system. Oh, and I put a picture of a pizza up here. I grew up in the 90s, and we read books in order to earn a pizza party or to earn, read a lot of books this summer and get to go to Pizza Hut. That's a great example of a contrived reinforcement. There really is no connection between whether or not I read a book and I ate a pizza. So the downsides of this, when we set this up, we're actually setting up reinforcement of a rather narrow range of behavior. So if you tell me that I can read books on this list to get my pizza party, am I really going to read a book that's not on the list? It's unlikely to generalize as a result. So we hope that this, engenders a love of learning, a love of reading, but once we don't have the pizza party, sometimes that breaks down. It can also feel contrived, it can feel very fake or maybe even infantilizing. And sometimes this is set up so that it makes the teacher's job easier. Maybe it makes the classroom easier to manage. Sort of, it's for me, it's not for you. So instead, what I teach is more focused on what are called natural reinforcers. And these are tied to real-world situations and the real-world outcomes that the people involved actually want. So we situate that in the goals of the people participating and make it feel more authentic. So in the context of either a classroom environment or even just in a relationship, a natural reinforcer would be something like having your request granted. So if you make a reasonable request and the other person says, yes, I can do that for you, it makes it more likely that you'll make requests in the future. Receiving an answer to a question is reinforcing, because if I sort of blow it off and I don't really take it seriously, or I don't respond, or I say, that's out of the scope, then you say, oh, I guess I won't ask questions again in the future. Receiving attention is naturally reinforcing. And there are some situations, and this is where I hope to take my students in terms of their therapy skills, take them in terms of developing human connections that feel naturally reinforcing. So our question is, can we use natural reinforcers in the classroom to increase student participation, productive dialogue, difficult conversations, bravery, openness, curiosity? In this tradition, the therapist is using things like natural reinforcement to increase things like vulnerability, disclosing, sharing, and we're hoping to teach people more effective relational behavior through our responses to people live in real relationships. And so here's kind of one of the frameworks I want to give you. In this treatment, we use a shorthand called ones and twos. A one represents an old, ineffective, relationally ineffective behavior pattern. So it might be something like not asking for help, holding back, being defensive, being protected, something like this, where the other person has a hard time connecting with you. A two is just you trying something new and different. It doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be growth. So it might be making a request, being a little bit more vulnerable or open or disclosing, and we want more of that. So I brought a little example from this treatment. This is out of a textbook. The client says, every time my wife criticizes my behavior, I get defensive. And the therapist says, is it possible that's happening here with us? And the client says, no, it's completely different here. Why would you even ask that? So here we have a good example of what we would call a one, which is this defensiveness. It's really inhibiting the connection in that moment. So the therapist challenges a little bit and asks for the new behavior that they want. Could you try it a different way, essentially? And so this is what I'm always thinking about in my classroom and with my students is, how do I ask for or prompt those twos so that we can have more productive and more connected experiences? And the client responds, I feel like, my mood changes quickly. I feel like my esteem is deflated, and the therapist reinforces. That makes me feel so much more connected to you. So there's the natural reinforcement. We assume the person wants connection. We say what you just did there, that increased the connection. So if we take this out of the clinical and into the classroom, we have these concerns here at HXA about self-censorship, about participation, having difficult dialogues. So how can we use these principles to kind of shape our classroom environment? So we can assume within this model that whatever our students are doing in the classroom, they've learned through reinforcement, including negative reinforcement, like not feeling anxious, getting rid of a feeling of tension or something like that. We assume that we and our responses are always reinforcing, whether we know it or not, whether we like it or not. So whatever we're doing is in interaction with what the students are doing. We also assume that we are what's called discriminative stimuli. So this is something that influences how students behave. And basically it brings out a new behavior. We serve as the antecedent that brings out the behavior. So we are both the stimulus and the consequence. So how do I use this? I'm actually teaching this like this, basically, but then I do it at the same time. So I weight my course heavily towards discussion, participation, and practice. And so I start by defining this very clearly. What would be classroom ones and twos, especially what are twos? I kind of take the focus off the ones and place heavy focus on what would be really effective of them. Understanding that that's still contextual. Sometimes I want some more of one behavior, but then in a new context, I don't want that anymore. So essentially, I'm trying to bring out the twos and then reinforce those. So my style of using this is I kind of really dial up interpersonal warmth and reinforcement. So when students are, because I notice sometimes they can be shy about getting started in discussions right away. So the first person who raises their hand to offer a suggestion, I'm like really excited. I'm really interested. Yes, I'm loving this, right? And I will like take the volume up just a little bit without necessarily being fake. You can't go so far as to be false because then that you're working against yourself. But I'm just sort of like dialing the temperature up just a little bit. Same thing if I've primed them that I want them to be disagreeing or I want to have different viewpoints. When someone says, I don't know if I see it that way, I say, yes, what are you saying? And I sort of know saying this to you all that you probably already do this as well, but I just sort of want to offer you like the structure and the framework for saying what is it that's happening in that moment. just so that you can kind of put it into a framework. Same thing goes for the way I communicate outside of the class, you know, my emails, my syllabus, things like that, and how I handle requests, problems, you know, like requests for extensions, or I didn't like that we talked about that, and things like this. I will say, as I was making these slides, that I screenshotted some of them, and then I noticed that this felt really vulnerable for me to put my own stuff up on the screen like this. So I just want to acknowledge that this is kind of a two for me to share this. Thank you. Love it. So this is an example of how I might communicate, because I teach one of my classes as a weekend intensive, so we're kind of locked in Saturday and Sunday all day with each other. And so I will send an email, depending on how they did. Like, if it went well, I'll send this email that says, I am absolutely blown away by your hard work this weekend. So I could say, you know, thank you for your hard work, but I just like dial it up a little bit. I am blown away. A big thank you for your discussions, your questions, your not fully formed ideas, because I want more of that. So please give me more of that. You know, I was touched by how well you participated in all of this. This below, that's from 2021, but just an example of how I set it up in advance. I said I'll be adapting for remote learning. It was 2021. As always, your patience, feedback, and technical support are welcome and encouraged, because I kind of felt like I might need it. Other ways that I do this, I have a fairly direct style of communication. So if the answer is no, I try really hard to just say a direct no, like, I'm sorry, that's not going to be possible, rather than like, well, maybe, something like that, because I feel like that is going to sort of work in this training way where I don't want to train you to think that I'm going to, you know, equivocate or whatever. A no is just simply a no. I also use this, I sort of teach the students to do this themselves. So when they come back from a breakout, oftentimes they've been practicing interpersonal skills, and I'll say, who wants to shout out their partner for having done an excellent job in this breakout? So whose partner really nailed it while you were gone? And so they'll say, oh, you know, so-and-so, I just felt like she was really paying attention to me. And then we can all go, yeah, there you go, so-and-so. And then I also will set out things like policies about recording, privacy, confidentiality. That's sort of asking for the behavior that I want explicitly. And there are probably other ways, I'm just mindful of time. The last things, knowing yourself is really important. So one of the things I'm teaching them to do and that I want to do myself is just to know what my reinforcement style is so that it can feel authentic, but maybe like authentic plus. And knowing your own demeanor, because the other side of this is that once in a while we may be functioning as a punisher and not realizing that we're doing that. So depending on how we, for example, take questions, we could be punishing question asking just by sort of like maybe it's our facial expression or our demeanor or tension or something like that. And so knowing your strengths and weaknesses, I think, helps to create that environment that you're trying to create. That's maybe all I need to say about that. So here are your big takeaways. Define your ones and twos, reinforce the twos, work on turning those ones into twos in your function as a stimulus, and just being really aware of your reinforcing function in the classroom. Beware of your boundaries and role confusion, because I'm aware these are not my therapy clients, right? Know who you are to them. So even though it's inspired by therapy, it's not therapy. And then lastly, this is, you know, shameless self-promotion right here. I don't know how you measure if this works, but these are a couple of comments that I've gotten from students, so I do have a more semi-objective sense of whether or not what I'm doing is working. I felt respected, valued, and included in this class, a welcoming and supportive environment, blah, 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 blah. So, thank you very much.
And I think now that I'm down here, I'm going to use the mic for question askers as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful presentation. I'm a psychologist as fellow psychologist like yourself, school psychology. So I have a question. How do you manage silence in the classroom? So you'll ask a question, and I'm very comfortable, you know, as psychologists, we're very comfortable with silence. So I was just wondering, does that, would that, elicit like a 1 or a 2 type of behavior, and how do you manage it?
For the most part, thank you. For the most part, silence is probably a 1, unless it's like a really thoughtful silence that's really serving a great function. But for the most part, that's probably, them being, hesitant to participate. So what I have learned to do, not only do I let the silence sit, but I sort of try to convey with my face that, like, I am not coming in to rescue you. So I'm not going to be doing anything else until someone else someone else offers something. So kind of like stepping myself back so that I'm not working anymore. This is your question, So I'm going to kind of take myself out of it. Yeah, thanks.
Well, they're recording it, so it's more for the recording.
So I can see how, for students that already like to participate and love affirmation, this would motivate them to participate more. Are you seeing more students participating, as there's like maybe those students who normally don't want to talk? Are you seeing increased participation and increased discourse in the class from those students?
So I don't know how I would measure it. My gut says yes. Still sometimes a challenge. I think another thing I didn't touch on is, the way I show up in a kind of, I model vulnerability, I model humor, really kind of being myself with them. And so as thinking of that as kind of the discriminative stimulus to sort of say, you can be yourselves too. And so I'm often hearing from them on the breaks, like, this is going well, this is going well. And I'm like, yeah. Or there's like, I'm really enjoying this. Yeah, great. So I hope so.
Yeah, thanks for this. I think it's really helpful to take sort of a behavior analytic perspective and thinking about this. So I'm really, I think, maybe just offering a comment. But I think one of the challenges in terms of challenging conversations in the classroom is, if we're taking a sort of a Skinnerian view, is like escape conditioning, so that like they get really ready to say something interesting and thoughtful, but then they don't, and then they're reinforced for it because they were like anxious, but now that anxiety goes away because they didn't say something. And I think that might be missed in the sort of 1s and 2s system, but it's like trying to think about how to reduce that reinforcing value of being quiet that might be sort of a significant barrier. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but that's kind of just my observation, is that some of it is hidden in terms of kind of the reinforcement framework that might lead to more sort of deeper conversations in the classroom.
Yeah, no, you're identifying exactly one of the challenges. And excellently. So I guess my 2 thoughts on it would be, one, really reinforcing the students who do take the risk to speak out, even to sort of say, like I said, dial it up a little bit, like, that seems like that might have been risky for you to say, and I'm so glad, going back to the natural reinforcement, I'm so glad you shared it because it enhanced our discussion here. And so kind of putting anyone who does it, put them a little on a pedestal to say, you just enhanced your classmates' learning, excellent. And then prior to, you can still set up, hey, I know we're going to have challenging discussions. You might have the urge to say something, and then you might find yourself backing out. So what if you planned for that in advance and then you took the risk sometimes? Because that's actually part of the methodology as well, is to sort of ask we do it in therapy, like, could you share something vulnerable with me right now? So, yeah.
I just want to say, your whole framework around the reinforcement is just delightful and blowing my mind right now. I had not really thought of it the way you described it, but it's really seems to be built into the way that we do these, in our case, Braver Angels debates in classrooms and campuses, and I think Darren knows this and Lindsay knows this. My question is, what strategies do you think of, and what comes to mind with regard to the shy students? Lindsay has this phrase I steal all the time, courageous speech. Mm-hmm. And there's always a layer of students who stand up and they're very much confident in their public speaking and they like to get in front of an audience, but there's layers of students behind them who are very reluctant to do so. So what kind of reinforcement tactics and strategies do you recommend for those students?
So kind of similar to the one before, where I might kind of anticipate that and try to mind read them a little bit. Maybe like I might sort of guess. I'm sure there are some shy students in here, and you might not be used to speaking up, and so I would just want to invite you to be brave here. And so even that might be enough. There may also be other ways for them to contribute that wouldn't be quite as far of a leap for them. Could we have a system where we write it down and then everybody passes it up or something like that? So just to get, the idea of a 2 is that it's a little bit more growth, but it doesn't have to be all the way there yet. It just has to be a little bit more improved from where it was. So if there's some way that they can join in that's a little bit more than nothing, reinforce that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we're going to
Thank you for your help.
go into the next presentation.
Again, Darren Hicks, Steve Johnson. Also want to recognize Rob Margison. We together lead a debate across the curriculum program at the University of Denver. We're in our 3rd year. I spent 2 years piloting the program, and this year we've expanded it to include 3 dedicated faculty members to the program. We've held over 160 debates in those last 3 years and reached over 2,500 students. I just want to share with you a little bit about the program, why we started it, how we had to redesign debate in order to make it work, how the DAC program works operationally, how we evaluate the DAC program, and finally share some of our empirical results with you. 2 rationales. A lot of this comes from conversations that I was having with my Chancellor Jeremy Hafner, our Provost Mary Clark, about students' engagement in classrooms on civic issues and on controversial topics. And we noted 2 things. First, there's been seeming a decline in critical civic capacities. That is, evidence-based reasoning, but even more so, a decrease in the willingness and ability of students to engage in what John Rawls calls public reason. That is, the ability to provide reasons that could be acceptable to all. And that requires a lot of ability to think outside of your own perspective, model other perspectives, be able to represent those, understand the consequences of that. Also, as Whitney was just talking about, rising levels of self-censorship among students. Of course, we know that students fear the judgment of their peers. That's what the HXA surveys have shown quite readily, as well as negative reprisal from their instructors. What we've really discovered is a third sort of kind of manifestation of this, and we call it typecasting. That is, there's a decrease in the space now between the expression of an argumentative viewpoint and the ascribed social identity of the person issuing that expression. That is, there's hardly any space between argument and identity anymore. So each time you say something, it is as if you are branding yourself in a group of peers, and people don't want to be typecast. College should be the space where we have some room for exploration between the views we might adopt and who we eventually become. And so we think that conflation of argument and identity is really what's drawing these students to self-censor. Now, we knew that decades of research showed that debate was very good in terms of fostering our ability to think critically, have confidence in our communication skills, have greater empathy for other views. But we also knew that it was a great way to combat what we call verbal aggression. So verbal aggression is when you attack the speaker rather than the position the speaker expresses, right? And again, going along with a conflation of argument and identity, that is, each utterance is a brand for me, then you can imagine how easy it is to start attacking the speaker, which only is a reinforcing cycle, behavioral cycle, it's a punishment, if you will, as Whitney was just saying. And so you see less and less students speaking all the time. And we knew that debate could, in particular, help reduce verbal aggressiveness. But we knew we had to redesign debate, especially given the affective and emotional environment that we're dealing with. If these issues are really driven by emotional and affective variables, then we have to get rid of the idea of debate as this gladiatorial sport that students feared so much. We had to address the concerns with binary thinking that the critics of debate have talked about. So what we've done is think about debate, redesigning debate around 3 core principles. The first, our debates are non-competitive. There are no winners or losers. Rather, we talk about the history of debate and the essence of debate as being dialectical interchange. That is a collective search for truth that has 3 discrete phases: inquiry and reflection, debate as a method of surfacing difference, and then deliberation as a way of coming back after the debate, shedding the role of advocate, and beginning to think together as citizens. Second, we knew the debates had to be fully participatory. That is, everyone in the class participates, and 2 strands of this. First, we knew that giving people not only equal opportunity, but actual equal floor space, that is, they all speak for the same amount of time, they receive the same amount of questions, was one surefire way to increase feelings of psychological safety. Secondly, we also know, and we use examples of sports with the students, that is, you think about players on the field in a Premier League soccer match. After the whistle blows, they embrace. Who doesn't? The people in the stands. They're wearing the colors, they're singing the chants, they're fighting. Why is that? Because spectating quickens conviction. That is, if you are just watching something, in order to stay engaged and emotionally invested, you will begin wanting it to be a contest with a winner and a loser. You will want the vanquishment of your opponent, or the opposing team, and then add a sports betting culture to that. Then you can imagine what is happening, and we talk about that in politics, has become a spectator sport. Why you're seeing this increased rise in affective polarization and, warring convictions is because we're too much in a spectator role. So we're all players. That means debate becomes an exercise in collective problem solving. And finally, on conviction building, we want to instill into students the idea that conviction should be the result of dialogue and debate, not its prerequisite. Most of them think you already have to stand up and only argue if you truly believe it. And you want to be authentic when you do that. We say, no, we're going to randomly assign you to sides of this debate. Hopefully, many of you will speak against what you might believe. But we're not asking you to say that's your belief. We're going to teach you how to vigorously represent a view that is not your own. Even if you want to distantiate yourself from it, that's fine. But if you can do that, then you can start reasoning publicly. So I'm going to let Steve talk to you a little bit about how the program works in practice.
So one of the key things to understand about the DAC program at DU is that it is a facilitated program. And I use that word to distinguish it from many other examples of DAC programs that exist. We're not the first DAC program in the nation. We're not the only DAC program in the nation. But one of the features that distinguishes us is that we are heavily guided by debate professionals. Between Rob, Darren, and I, we have over 120 years of experience in competitive academic debating. And we are present with the faculty members and the students throughout the entirety of this process. So rather than just a sort of module that we create for the Faculty Development Center that offers guidance to other faculty who might be interested in having a debate in their class, we are literally there with them through the entirety of this process. And that's useful to understand because this 4-step process kind of depends upon our heavy involvement with that effort. We begin with a collaboration with the faculty member. We invite faculty members to participate. This program is entirely voluntary. It is not compulsory, and so we get some benefit from the selection bias there of faculty who are enthusiastic or at least receptive to the idea of hosting these debates in their classes. And we work extensively with them one-on-one to find controversy in their course material that resonates with their course objectives and with what their students' interests might be for that particular course. And that's been very useful because I think it demonstrates a couple of important things. One is that there are controversies in every discipline in academia. The vast majority of the work that we do is to evaluate competing arguments in the establishment of knowledge. We trace that back and sometimes even retrace those steps in terms of the production of knowledge that has surfaced in that discipline. and giving students the opportunity to participate in that conversation through some of those controversies. So we're present in all sorts of courses, from your typical humanities courses and social sciences courses where you might expect to find us, to places that you might not expect to find us in the natural sciences, in mathematics and statistics, in business settings. Those sorts of things have been quick to embrace this approach as well because of our commitment to locating that in the disciplinary information. We work with those faculty members not only to identify a subject, but then also to refine our topic, right? What we're going to be debating about, and importantly to offer additional structure to that topic so that we give students a great deal more guidance on how the controversy can unfold and making that exchange of arguments, pro and con, more productive. Once we have that in place then, we come to the classroom for our first visit. And in this first visit, we do a couple of things. We spend a lot of time orienting the students toward debate in general, explaining to them its important role in the broader culture, in the establishment of epistemological knowledge, and why this is an important skill for them to develop. And then, of course, we introduce the practical exercise. You heard Darren mention some of the things that we do, assigning students positions randomly, thereby re-emphasizing the function of debate as a method by which we seek truth, rather than emphasizing this notion that they're going to win or one side's going to lose. Since we don't know and they don't know what their individual convictions are, we free them and give them cover to express the arguments vigorously and in that pursuit of truth, rather than to be identified with a particular position that may mark them and subject them to that social judgment. We ask them also to write a brief, and so that preparation is guided by their own exploration outside of class, bringing to that the opportunity to develop those research skills and find good quality evidence and compelling reasoning that will substantiate the claims that they're trying to articulate in the class. Once that visit is done, usually about a half hour's worth of visit, 45 minutes or so, we come back for our second visit. And during that second visit is where we actually conduct the debate. You heard Darren mention earlier that we have a fully participatory model, which means that we are having every student speak during that debate. There are no audience members sitting passively just watching the debate. Everyone is involved throughout the entirety of it. That's certainly easy to do when we have some of our smaller 8 to 10 to 12 person classes, but gets to be more of a challenge when we're working on the 40 or 60 or sometimes 125 student classes. But we're finding ways to make it work. That process is relatively simple. Each student gets the same amount of time to present their argument, and then that is typically followed by a question and answer session. There are a couple of different ways that we approach that, but those elements are common throughout every debate experience that we do. An opportunity to present an argument and a requirement that you defend an argument and participate in the inquisition about other arguments from the opposing side. We finally then return to the class for a third visit, and during that third visit we take one of two approaches. If we're limited in time, that is, the instructor has a desire to limit the amount of time that we're spending with them so they can get to other course material, we do a sort of open debrief with the students, asking them to identify arguments that they appreciated from the other side, re-emphasizing that notion that there is compelling argument even from the position that you might have not have been assigned or that you might not have defended. If there's opportunity for a more extended interaction with the students following that debate experience, we engage in a full-blown deliberation. You heard Darren mention earlier that we sometimes ask students to shed the role of advocate and assume the role of decision-maker citizen. This is one of my favorite parts of this experience because this allows students then to shift that perspective from where they're trying to make a case for something to where they're now working hard to evaluate that case. And we structure deliberation exercises in small groups where they will have to interact with others who have formed an individual opinion with the goal of coming to consensus on a collective decision that all members of that group share. And the real magic that happens in this process is that revelation of difference of perspective, where a student will say, I never heard that argument, or I didn't understand that argument in that way, or oh, that's what that argument was supposed to mean. By interacting with those perspectives and sharing that different interpretation of those arguments, making an effort to coordinate those perspectives amongst all group members, you get a lot of really insightful commentary about the quality of the arguments that are being made, how people see those arguments differently, how they interact with each individual value set that the student brings to that debate differently, and they're doing a lot of real deep metacognition at that point, thinking about how they're thinking about the debate, by seeing how others are thinking about the debate and comparing that to their own perspectives. So this entire process involves, as I said, 3 classroom visits, somewhere around 6 to 8 hours between the consultation to the final conclusion, depending upon how much time we spend with them. So it's a very intensive experience. And again, all of this is led by one of the 3 faculty members who work with the DAC program. And so a critical part of this has been to apply that expertise to that experience. The reason that's important is because we're also deeply committed to the evaluation of this program. We aspire at the University of Denver to make this functional not only for our student body, but to serve as a model for other universities to accept as well. To do that, we know that we must be able to validate the outcomes that we're experiencing. Now, Rob, Darren, and I will spend a lot of time telling you how debate transformed our lives when we were literally starting as teenagers throughout the commitment of our entire professional life to this practice of debate. But we want to be able to convince others that it actually works and is worth doing as well. So our evaluation is guided by 3 broad approaches, 3 broad principles that we follow. First, that we commit to that consistent and rigorous program evaluation, making sure that we're constantly collecting data both to refine the program and to demonstrate its efficacy. Second, that guides our scaling strategies. We're growing slowly to make sure that we don't over-accommodate and therefore compromise our ability to maintain the quality of the experience that we're offering for the students as well as for the faculty. And finally, that we have a deep commitment to fidelity, knowing that we're trying to replicate the experience and making sure that our data reflects the replication of similar experiences across classrooms. We spend a lot of time coordinating amongst each other as facilitators and watching each other facilitate debates to make sure that our approaches are similar across a variety of different experiences. This has produced some encouraging results. And I'm going to cover the first one. Broadly speaking, we kind of track results in two categories. First, the sort of scholastic or pedagogical outcomes that we're seeking, and then secondly, the more civic-oriented ones. These are some of the things that we're tracking here. And so the data that we're analyzing is establishing a pretty decent set size at this point. Our N is around 1,400 of the sort of 2,000 students' experiences that we had last year. We were able to find 1,400 of these paired responses that allow us to use a pre-test, post-test assessment to demonstrate that we are having are accomplishing the outcomes and the objectives that we're looking for. And in this category, we're looking at things like whether or not topic knowledge increases as a result of participating in the debate. Do students learn more about the subject they're debating? Unsurprisingly, they report that they have significant growth in their understanding of the topic as a consequence of engaging in the debate, between the research, the contemplation of it, the advocacy for it, as well as the discussion of it afterwards. They engage that material a great deal more deeply and benefit from that engagement as well. They also come to appreciate debate more as a pedagogical practice. They understand that arguing about things is a good way to better understand that thing, and so they appreciate the process of debate more in that context of contributing to the course outcomes that they're seeking. I'm going to turn it over back now to Darren and let him comment on some of the rest of the other outcomes that we're measuring as well.
Great. Yeah, I'll share. We've got about 3 minutes. I'll share pretty quickly with some of the other outcomes, and we can certainly come back to these slides in the Q&A. So the other thing, one of the other things we measure is that fear of speaking out, or what is their comfort increasing as students sharing their views in the face of disagreement in front of their peers and in front of their instructors. You see a really nice increase in comfort, especially with the instructors, as you can see here. We then also look at how debate can foster intellectual humility. During the pilot, we did that by looking at students on a scale of whether or not they could admit that they were wrong sometimes. And we looked at the subset of students who said, no, I'm very rarely wrong. And then after participating in the debate, we saw 55% of them admitting that their views changed with evidence, and almost 27% saying, oh yeah, in my previous life I had overlooked evidence, which is a sign of intellectual humility. For this year, the last 2 quarters, we're trying a secondary strategy to measure intellectual humility and creating an HI composite score, as you can see on the top, with these kinds of questions. You would question my views, I reconsider opinions, I recognize the value of others' opinions, I accept my beliefs may be wrong, I can accept conflicting evidence, and I'm really curious about finding info that differs from my views. That's our strongest increase right there. So we're still still refining this measure, but so far it seems to have some promise. And so you can see there's a slight increase here in intellectual humility, and we'll keep working on that. Then finally we'll end with polarization. We measure polarization in two ways: topic polarization, right? So how do I feel that others of the students in this class differ from me and my own views about the topic, and whether or not that perceived difference decreases with participation in DAC. And in this last year, we've also started using a more general affective polarization model using a feeling thermometer. And the reference point here is all students on campus and how close or far apart they feel from those students. And again, we see some significant movement in that direction too. So in topic polarization, in here, the gold means that we are decreasing polarization on topic, and we are significantly decreasing affective polarization as well. And finally, we are now to the point where we're starting to have repeat users of the program. So in the last 2 quarters, 35% of the students had engaged in one of our debates before, and we want to measure whether or not repeated exposure seems to have any effects. So one promising sign of that is, of the people who had participated in the past, they reported higher comfort as an initial starting condition, and that comfort increased at the same rate it did in their prior debate. So we have some hope here that repeated exposures to this will keep on increasing the salience of these outcomes. And you know, our goal is to have everyone at DU debate at least twice while they're at campus. We target the first year seminar and our advanced seminar. That's why we're getting some repeats, because the advanced seminar they take in their junior year, so we had them when they were first year students. But we also look at other classes all across the campus. Our goal with DAC is to create the university as a robust site of public argument. We think that's what a university should be. We can equip students to do that better and hopefully have them carry that out into their lives after college. Thank you.
All right, we have about 5 minutes for questions.
So I definitely want to be a DU student. Just can you talk a little bit about the affective polarization, because as you're looking across a curriculum, this is not necessarily ideological differences. Can you talk about that measurement a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Is this on?
Yes.
Oh yeah. So yeah, on affective polarization, again, that's why we began with topic polarization, because we wanted to say, on this topic, how do you perceive yourself in relationship to your peers? But you know, some of our topics are really hot button issues, like transgender participation in sports, reproductive rights, you know, political economy issues, migration, but some of them are not. We might debate, you know, one of my favorite debates ever was on, should we define the tree of life in astrophysics, and in order to include different kinds of microbial, I can't say the word, microbial entities, right? Which was a fantastic debate. And very quickly they understood that how deep reaching that is, and when you do that, how it changes your core value set. But on its face, they're not going to think that they're polarized on that. So we wanted a campus-wide measure. That's why we went to the feeling thermometer. How do you feel, how you're placed in campus among your peers, which we think also might drive some of this self-censorship.
Thank you for your presentation. You mentioned how the spectator kind of dynamic can influence the debate process, but I'm assuming you're having these debates in the classroom. Do you see a spectator dynamic with students who are like in the room, or is that not something that's really happening?
You know, we haven't seen that much of it, partly because they all know they're going to speak. So they are pretty actively engaged because they know they're going to be coming up, and even after they're speaking, they're presented their advocacy, they're going to be in the role of the questioner at some point. So we have it they keep on their toes a little bit. You know, that doesn't mean someone doesn't get on their phone every now and then and we have to give them the stink eye, but you know, so there might be a little spectator effect, but we haven't seen that quickening of conviction happen because of disengagement.
Could you say just a bit more about the large class size. So I'm thinking of if everybody gets a moment and there's 60 per
Yeah.
So how does that work?
So just to clarify, and perhaps in relation to the previous question that was just asked, one debate in a 40-person class will have 20 people on the pro side and 20 people on the con side in that single debate, and we run that as one experience. How do we manage the larger classes? There are a couple of strategies that we're working with. One is to form the students more as teams. So rather than saying each student gets 2 to 3 minutes to present an individual argument, that might be one of 5 or 6 arguments that are presented in that context, which then would take us up to somewhere around 18 minutes just to get those arguments out. We say you 6 students are now a team representing this position on this one particular sub-issue, which is part of the substructure that we use, and you have a total of 7 minutes collectively to prepare, to articulate your argument. Everyone must participate in the articulation of that argument, so you've got to figure out a way for all 6 of you to speak during those 7 minutes, but they've worked together previously to comprise that 7-minute case that they are going to present. That's one of the ways that we can constrain the amount of time that it takes. In the super large class that we did, the 125-person class, we actually took that class and broke it into 3 sections, 3 different debates, that all 3 of us ran one debate in a different classroom simultaneously.
I think we can do one more quick question.
Thank you. It was helpful to hear examples of the types of debate topics you do, and I'm curious if you see differences, like when you have a more neutral topic, like a tree of life type topic, where it's not generally probably as polarizing in society and is not so related, I imagine, to people's identities in the room. Like, do those debates look different than when you have the more like hot button or identity related things in terms of how people engage?
Yeah, it's not something that we're tracking in terms of quality of the topic and the meaningfulness or the degree of change in the response. That's not something that we've been tracking in our research. We've talked about doing some of that, coding the topics for controversiality, for example, might be something that we'll work on in the future. My gut tells me that some of the best debates I've seen are topics that I personally wasn't that excited about because they didn't feel very controversial, but the students and the course lent them to a sort of engagement with the topic that they were really excited about. For example, we did an advanced anatomy and physiology course that contemplated the topic of whether we should consider aging to be a disease and treat it as a disease. And I saw that topic and I'm like, wow, are we really going to get it? And they tore it apart. It was a great topic. It was a great debate that worked really well for that particular set of students. I've often seen really boring debates on what I thought were controversial topics too, so it kind of depends.
Yeah, no, we haven't seen any change in that effect, but we're going to refine that measurement strategy for sure.
Okay, well, thank you all for participating. Thank you to our presenters, and I think now it's lunch.